the Code 4 Couples podcast, where our goal is to provide information and topics to keep our hometown heroes' relationships safe in Code 4. I'm your host, Cindy Doyle, LEO wife and licensed professional counselor, and thanks for joining me today. So I'm going to tell you a story. This is a story I tell frequently in session, and I just thought maybe it'd be fun to share this with y'all today. I don't like that. Oops, somebody really wants you. Somebody left a message, huh?
Twitter.
Oh.
Not important.
Okay. I'm going to start over. You can cut out that.
That's fine.
Put that thing in that thing. Okay. So today I'm going to share with you my sponge story. This is not the Seinfeld story where it's about contraception. I don't think some of you may remember that. Some of you might be too young for that, but that's not what this one is. This is an actual sponge, like a kitchen sponge. So early in my relationship, and actually for several years, my husband would come home and he would be in uniform and he would go to the kitchen and pick up the sponge. And he would take the sponge and start wiping down the counters and wiping down the stove. And he would take the sponge and kind of huff and puff and just kind of, you know, that kind of noise. And then he would wring it out. And then sometimes he would take it and he would put it in the microwave and for like a minute and just kind of make those kinds of noise and just kind of throw the sponge down afterwards and then like walk off into the bedroom. And I would see this when he would come home and when I was home and he would come home and I was there. Sometimes I wouldn't see it because I wouldn't be home or I'd be asleep, but it was pretty consistent. And so I thought it odd, but I was thinking, okay, well, you know what this is about? This is about the fact that his mom was really kind of a neat freak and my parents were not. And so there must be like, maybe I'm leaving crumbs on the counter or something like that. So I'll just make sure that I wipe the counters, like make sure I'm doing a good job wiping the counters. It seems like, you know, like I'm not doing a good enough job as a wife cleaning up the kitchen. So I really worked on that. And I worked on the fact that I made sure all the crumbs were off. We have granite countertops and so they're like speckled. And so sometimes you can't see the sesame seeds or the salt or the pepper or whatever's on the counter because, you know, they're speckled and everything blends in. So I made sure like I would wipe them off and then I'd like run my hand over it to make sure that they were all clean. And I thought, score, he's going to come home and he's going to just be like, wow, this kitchen is awesome, wife, and like go in and be able to relax. But that didn't happen. He would come in and he would pick up the sponge and grumble and wipe down the counters and do this. And so, and then every now and then I would hear him like streaks on the stove, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, okay, all right, I'll get it better. I'll get it better next time. I will make sure that there are no streaks on the stove. We had a black stove and you know, sometimes things don't get cleaned up as well. So I was like, okay, all right, I'm going to make the stove streak free. And so I would wipe it down and sometimes I'd still see the streaks. And so I get this special towel and kind of wipe it down again to make sure there are no streaks on the stove. And make sure the counters are, run my hand over the counters and be like, okay, is this clean? Is it crumb and streak free? Because I want to make sure that when he comes home, he can have less stress. That was my goal. And so I was waiting for him to come home and he'd come home and he'd walk in the kitchen and pick up the sponge and he'd wipe down the counters. And so eventually in my head, I would be thinking mean and nasty thoughts. I thought, you know what? Screw you, buddy. I am cleaning up the stove, and if I can't be as good as your mama, then you know what? I don't care. And so I would get like resentful and kind of in my head, I would cuss him out because I know better than to actually say it. And so I would cuss him out in my head and I'd be like, he's just ridiculous. He's got he's got OCD, you know. I would come up with all these mean things, and so I started like making up other stories like in my head of like, he's ridiculous. I can never do anything right when it comes to the kitchen. I'm inadequate. His mom does better than I do, and I made up like all these stories. So here you hear the stories. The first story is that I didn't clean the kitchen well enough because when I was younger, that really wasn't like a huge thing if there were breadcrumbs on the counter. And so, gosh, I need to raise my standards. And so I need to be better. That was the first story I was telling myself. And so then the second story I was telling myself is like, well, he just thinks I'm not good enough and his mom was better. And so one day, many years into our relationship, it still goes on today, by the way. There are still times he comes home and he picks up the sponge and he grumbles and he cleans off the counter. So, like, probably, I'm going to say 7 to 10 years into our relationship. Like, this is years of this going on. Finally, I got the nerve up to ask him. But man, I prepared for that conversation because what I wanted to say was, what's your problem, buddy? What's your issue with the way I clean? And that's really what I wanted to say. And I wanted to fight. But, you know, I also know that that's probably not the most productive way. But inside, like, I was ready to throw down. I wanted to, like, you know what, screw you. You know, I was ready. So, I mean, it took me probably a week to figure out how I wanted to say this, but also to, you know, find that time when he was home and I was home. So we're working on, you know, how to work on that. And so I finally figure out, okay, what am I going to say? How am I going to say this? And what I finally said is, so can you help me understand why you come home and want to wipe down the counters? And that was the best I could do. And he looks at me and he's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, a lot of times you come home and you wipe down these counters, and my thought is that you're thinking I'm a horrible housekeeper and don't know how to clean a kitchen. And he looks at me and says, this doesn't have anything to do with you. And I was shocked. I was like, what? He says, no, it's just that all day I work with stuff that I can't control. I work with people that, like, I'm cleaning up their messes and, like, they're acting like idiots, and, like, I cannot control how anybody else is doing things. I have to respond to them. I have to watch what I'm doing. I have to, like, and I build up all day because it just drives me kind of crazy after a while. And so there are days when I feel like I haven't controlled anything in my life. And so when I come home, I pick up the sponge because I think at least I can control how clean my kitchen is. And I was totally enlightened because that is not what I was thinking at all. And I was like, so it has nothing to do with me at all. He says, no, it doesn't have anything to do with you. He says, no, yeah, I like it when there's not streaks on the stove and that when the English muffin little crumbs aren't everywhere. Yeah, do I like that? Fine. But no, I'm not thinking that you're a crappy housekeeper or that you don't know how to clean a kitchen. I'm not thinking that at all. I'm just thinking, at least I can control something in my life. And that was, like I said, an incredibly eye-opening moment that it's not always about me. And so that changed things. And there are so many times that I think because we don't have the communication on a regular basis, that we're left to interpret things. And naturally, we interpret them in a way that makes sense based upon our reality and our experiences and our story. But if we don't check it out, we act upon those things that may not be true. So I don't necessarily like confrontation, and that's why I hold my tongue a lot. But if I was totally okay with confrontation, there would have been many fights about a stupid sponge. Trust me, there would have been like sponges thrown, because really what I felt was just so much resentment and anger, but in actuality it had nothing to do with me. So there's a couple different things that I want to encourage you to do here. First of all, I think we need to be aware of our own stories, and that goes for both sides of the fence. So you need to be aware of the story that you're telling yourself versus the facts of the situation. So in that story, the fact was that he came home still in uniform, seriously, vest and all, like gun belt, everything was on. So the story, the facts were he came home, he picked up a sponge, and he cleaned the counter. My interpretation of those facts was based upon the story that I was creating in my head and based upon my experiences and my thoughts about myself and everything else. So if you can pause and think about, all right, what are the facts and how am I interpreting? What's the story I'm creating around that event? Because in doing that, it can help to clarify maybe what's real and maybe made up, for lack of a better word. You know, and some of that is stories that you create based upon your own experiences. And the interpretation in your relationship. So in our relationship, I know my husband likes a clean kitchen. I know that, and we both worked in the restaurant industry in prior lives. So, you know, chicken on the counter is a big no-no in our world. But I don't scrub it down with, you know, Clorox wipes. He does, and he will Clorox a sink after chicken. But you know, that's him. He's a little bit of a germaphobe, and so I know that about him. And so my part of that was I wanted to please him. I wanted to be good enough. And the other part of that story was how I grew up and the comparison between the two. So the phrase that you can use when you want to talk to your spouse about something like this is like, wait a minute, maybe this isn't about me, maybe this is something else. If you can pause and think about that, the phrase that you can use is, the story I am telling myself about this is. And when you say that phrase, it stops any kind of accusatory language. And it says, hey, this is my story that I'm telling myself. You're involved in this story, but this story isn't that you're bad or that I'm accusing you or I'm criticizing you. Like, this is how I'm viewing things, and I need you to help me with this. And it provides an opportunity to check things out, and it actually clarifies so many things that could lead to an argument. And that phrase to me is just incredibly helpful. We all think in narratives. We make up stories. When we don't have facts, we make up stories. We fill in the gaps because our brain wants an answer. And so because of that, you know, we fill it in with things that a lot of times are negative. Very rarely do I fill in things and go, oh, he's probably cleaning it because he loves me. I don't, that's not what you think, right? You think about, oh, this is some kind of criticism. So take a pause. Next time you have a story in your head and you're building up negative emotion, think about if there's a story you're making up around a situation. We personalize things. And we take ownership for things that we don't need to take ownership for. I tell people often, It's not always about you. And that's not a mean thing. It's just that a lot of times we think it is about us and it's not. So next time something happens like that for you, you can think about the sponge story. Hopefully that's helpful and you can get something out of it. If you would like to make a comment or share your little story, if you have your own personal sponge story, I would love to hear it. So feel free to contact me or find me on social media. I have a plethora of social media thanks to the lovely Whitney. I am on Facebook and Twitter, LinkedIn. I am now active on Pinterest, which I love Pinterest. So on Pinterest, I'm also recording podcasts on video, so you can find me on YouTube as well. And also I love Instagram. So find me through any one of those. You can also contact me through email at Cyndi, CYNDI, at code4couples.com, which is the website. I would love for you to follow me on anything or share any of the podcasts or information that I put out. You know, my whole goal is to keep the relationships safe that we have as far as our first responders and anybody else that can benefit from this. I really appreciate that. So thanks for joining me and listening. And until next time, keep your relationship code 4.